Namaskar, friends, and welcome once again. In this class, I intend to talk about M.G. Basanji. M.G. Basanji falls in the category of those writers who has multiple migrations, and so his novel talks about his experiences in different locales. Actually, his family migrated from India to East Africa, and he himself was born in Kenya in 1950, raised in Tanzania, and later on immigrated to Canada, where he became a very prominent figure in Canadian literature. And his writings often reflect his East African Indian heritage and diasporic experiences, making him a key voice in post colonial transnational literature. So, these are some of the details, friends. As I said, he was born in Kenya in 1950 to Indian immigrants raised in Tanzania and later on settled in Canada, and he embodies the experience of double displacement from Gujarat to East Africa and then from Africa to the West. And so the themes of migration, diaspora, colonial history, which has impacted their lives, that also finds prominent mention. Well, friends, if we look at the patterns of diaspora and the experiences of diaspora, to a great extent, we'll find that the colonial history in India has impacted it deeply. So, whether we talk about the colonial diaspora or we talk about the post colonial diaspora, they have all been affected to a great extent by the colonial history in India, while the colonial diaspora was a direct outcome of colonial rule in India. And with the abolition of slavery, the colonial masters needed cheap labor, and as a result, Indians were taken to different parts of Africa, Caribbeans, and other places, and that impacted their life and resulted in colonial diaspora. In the post colonial diaspora, also, we find that being a colonial nation, we have our limitations, and that is the reason why, our people have gone to places in order to better opportunities for job and better life conditions. So, you know, and it continues to haunt us. It was the colonial rule that resulted in bifurcation of India and Pakistan, and now we can see the tension rising, and this has been impacting our economy, our lives as well. So, um, not for a moment we have been out of our colonial uh, experiences, and more so in the case of those people who were uprooted at that point in time from their country, and were forced to live in uh, societies or nations they had no idea about, and they remained always on the margins. In many cases they were sandwiched between the black and white populations, as is the case with MG Basanji. And later, in this part of our novel, the discussion will focus our discussion on the in between world of Mr. Bikram Lal, and you know this in between world of Bikram Lal is symbolic of the sandwiched life that the people of Indian origin had to lead in the African countries. So, well, themes of migration, diaspora, colonial history, identity, and belonging, and the experiences of East African Asians find prominence in M.G. Basanji's work because he comes from that stock. If we look at his major works, and he is a widely acclaimed writer in that most of his works have been awarded some prizes and recognitions. So his Gunny Sack, which is a 1989 novel, and it was his debut novel, it won him a Commonwealth Writers' Prize. And he talks about the diasporic identity and hybridity in this novel, as he uses the metaphor of gunny sack filled with memories and secrets to explore the legacy of diasporic family. And again, his next novel, The Book of Secrets, won him a Giller Prize. And it intertwines colonial history with personal stories, using a discovered diary to reconstruct a layered past. The in between world of Bikram Lal, well, we will be having detailed discussion of this novel, which to me is one of the finest novels to come from Indian diaspora. So it won him a Giller Prize. When she was queen, this is another work by him. The Assassin Song, A Place Within Rediscovering India, is a travel memoir. And so he has also explored the post colonial themes, because he lived in post colonial South Africa, and he found how colonial rule has, left the nations, crippled, and they are not able to really come out of the shock that was colonial rule for them. In that, they have been so debilitated that once the colonial rulers leave them, they don't know how to really rule themselves, and that's why the countries turn chaotic. And so his novels often examine the lingering effects of colonialism in East Africa, including racial hierarchies, political upheaval, and cultural dislocation. For example, in No New Land, he depicts the challenges faced by immigrants in Canada, contrasting them with their former lives in Tanzania, whereby highlighting the colonial legacy in both the places. So, when we talk about his narrative structure, like many of the diasporic writers, since these stories are based on memory and desire, mixing past and present, we often find that most of these writings follow a non linear storytelling technique. Basanji also employs this non linear storytelling or framed narratives and metafictional techniques, and his use of unreliable narrators and fragmented timelines mirror the complexity of reconstructing a diasporic history. And again, his cultural and religious complexities are quite apparent, because many of his characters belong to the Ismaili Muslim community, reflecting the nuanced intersections of religion, ethnicity, and culture in his narratives. For example, the In Between World of Bikram Lal, which is yet another Giller Prize winner, follows a character who is caught between different political and cultural allegiances in post independence Kenya. And as I said, we will be talking about it. So, if we talk about Basanji as a novelist, he stands out as one who breezes continents, cultures, and histories. And through evocative prose and complex characters, he sheds light on the lives of diasporic communities, the burden of memory, and the search for identity in post-colonial world. Let's see, he is a good example of double diaspora, as I said, or twice displaced, which explains why alienation, in betweenness, and unbelonging are recurrent themes in his novels, in particular, his novels Amrika, No New Land, and the In Between World of Vikram Lal. So for him, writing is a way of, uh, according to a degree of reality, to a hyphenated life, that of Asian immigrants who did not find their place in the grand narrative of the anti colonial struggle, and whose existence and life in Africa was likely to be forgotten after they left Kenya. And that's why writing was way of survival for him. So Zerzin and Donati highlight his narrative combines a reflection of the nature of life writing with an investigation into a relationship with the author's largely imagined ancestral's homeland. And so writing becomes, kind of means of survival for him. In one of interviews with Susila Nasta, he conveys, and I quote, "I live in Canada, and at some point I felt a tremendous sense of loss at being away from the place I grew up in. And what I did was try to recreate the life that we lived. But I think a more important motive, perhaps, is that life has never been lived. I mean, never been written about. It's something that is slowly being wiped out. And as the people who have experienced that life die away, die off, then there is no more record of that life. So that is the reason, uh, for him, writing is also a means of survival apart from reliving his memories. So Alexander observes his novels and short stories make meta-fictional use of the presence of journals, diaries, letters, and other life writing foundlings, some fictional, others historical, to introduce layers of meaning and to trigger plots and journeys. By understanding the motivations of unknown storytellers, the lost and forgotten writers of diaries, and letters, Basanji's protagonists are led to examine and comprehend their own motivations, and indirectly, we can say, the motivations of the writer himself, who believes that if they don't leave any written record of their life, they will be forgotten by history. So, if we look at his concerns as a writer, we find that he talks about the lives of diasporic people, and like many other writers, he himself has been a part of diaspora, rather double diaspora, and that's why his sense of loss is much more acute, because you know he has his roots from India, Gujarat, which he himself has never experienced firsthand. And he was born and raised in East Africa, where he was never accepted. And later on, when the East African countries gained freedom, again, he found himself caught in between the two dominant players, the colonial whites on the one hand, and the recently liberated, blacks on the other. And so he himself was uh, sandwiched between these two communities and always lived on the margins. And this marginal status is what has informed most of his creative world. So, as I proposed, one of his better known works is The In Between World of Bikram Lal. And why I chose this novel of all other novels is that uh, its title itself suggests the liminal status a diasporic has. And so, when we look at this narrative, which is narrated by Bikram Lal himself, who is looking back at his life and living currently in Canada, like the writer, we can find traces of the autobiographical elements in this novel. The novel was published in 2003 and won the Giller Prize, and it is narrated by Bikram Lal, the chief protagonist, who is an Indian Kenyan living in exile in Canada, very much like his creator himself. And as he reflects on his tumultuous life in Kenya from the 1950s to 1980s, the story unfolds. And the story spans almost 4 decades and explores the themes of identity, displacement, corruption, and the complexities of post colonial East Africa, and the chaos, the rebellion, the corruption, and everything, is presented in an integrated circuit kind of, where everything impacts everything else. So Vikram grows up in Nakuru, Kenya, with his sister Deepa. Their grandfather was an Indian railway laborer, and their parents are part of the Asian community, which finds itself in between the African majority and British colonials. As I said, they were sandwiched between blacks and whites. The siblings' childhood is marked by friendships with Njoroge, a Kikuyu boy, and British children Bill and Annie Bruce, symbolizing a fleeting hope for racial harmony. Well, all of us know that the children know no boundaries. And so we find that during the childhood of Bikram Lal, they freely mix up with both the native Africans and the Britishers. And at that point in time, they harbored a kind of expectation that racial harmony will prevail. But this does not happen. As the Mau Mau rebellion against the British rule erupts and this harmony is gone, the Bruces, the children, are killed. And as we have seen, violence has always been one of the integral parts of uh, diasporic experience. So, Bruces are killed, and Bikram is haunted by Annie's death, who happened to be his friend, and by witnessing his uncle Mahesh aiding the rebels, he again is not able to really understand on which side are they or what the condition is. The Lal family moves to Nairobi to escape the violence, separating them from Njoroge. So, we find that how their childhood world, the idyllic world, is completely shattered. And there is acute sense of, loss for the children at that point in time. In Nairobi, Bikram and Deepa reconnect with Njoroge, now an idealistic government official. Deepa and Njoroge fall in love, but their interracial relationship is forbidden by Deepa's mother, leading to heartbreak and separate marriages. So these are all offshoots of, diaspora, where uh, the diasporic community is much more culturally protected and conscious. And if I dare say, um, sometimes I jokingly say that many of the Indians living back home are more Americanized than many of the Indians living abroad. And why I say so? Because, uh, during my visits to these foreign countries, meeting Indian friends, I have seen how they have preserved their Indian culture by, making groups, by organizing regular, bhajan sandhyas, uh, Ramcharitmanas, and so on and so forth, by observing fast on uh, different occasions, Ekadasi, and many of our festivals, which back home we have forgotten mostly. So, if we look at these people, they try to protect their culture and are mostly found to be more conservative compared to the people back home who have moved on. So here we find that Deepa is not allowed to marry Enjoroge, who is a black, because they belong to two different races. Bikram becomes a railway inspector and is drawn into Kenya's growing bureaucracy, where his ambiguous ethnic status makes him a useful middleman for corrupt officials. So, his in between status between the Britishers and the native Africans also comes to haunt him in his job, where he becomes a middleman, who negotiates between the government officials and the contractors, and he is gradually pulled deeper into political corruption, laundering money and taking bribes. And when a scandal erupts, he is scapegoated and forced to leave civil services. Now, his minority status goes against him, because although it is not his willing participation in the corruption of newly liberated Kenya, but being margin minority, he is scapegoated when the moment comes, and as a result, he is forced to leave civil service. So, family tragedies follow. Njoroge is assassinated due to his political ideals. Deepa emigrates to the US, and Bikram's own family falls apart. So, as a result, ultimately, Bikram also flees to Canada, burdened by guilt and shame. And the novel highlights the in-betweenness of East African Asians caught between shifting powers and never fully belonging. So their situation does not really change, whether it is the colonial rule or the post-colonial Africa. They remain on the margins in a liminal space, forced to live in guilt and shame, like the protagonist of the novel. So, Bikram's journey mirrors Kenya's transition from colonialism to independence, revealing how personal and political histories intertwine. And colonial rule certainly was despotic and was exploiting the natives, but it was expected that when the colonial masters leave the country and the country gets freedom, uh, peace will be restored. But nothing of this sort happens. Rather, the same corruption and chaos prevails in the independent Kenya. And the situation of the uh, Indian people who had migrated during the colonial period never really changes, as they continued to live in a marginal space. The story ends with Bikram in exile, reflecting on the cost of survival and the enduring sense of displacement. So the story ends with Bikram in exile, reflecting on the cost of survival and enduring further sense of displacement, as he moves to Canada. If we look at this novel, this turns out to be one of the powerful narratives of diaspora. As I said, it grapples with the question of identity and in betweenness, as we find that it focuses on the liminal, marginal, or in between existence of East African Asians like Bikram, who are caught between African, British, and Indian cultures and never fully belong to any of the groups. And if we look at Bikram, his own identity is shaped by these multiple migrations and affiliations that lead to his persistent sense of ambiguity and a fragmented self. In Kenya's social order, Indians hold an ambiguous status because they are not entirely impressed by their local Africans, nor completely supportive of the British colonialists. They remain somewhere in between. So Malak points out, and I quote, with their multiple migrations and displacements, these East African Asians develop a multiplicity of affiliations. So, friends, we have seen that diasporic people are never allowed to send down their roots, and they are always kind of floating, sending down multiple, affiliations. So, the historical background of post colonial Kenya, where many ethnic minorities are struggling with their identities in the wake of independence, is also reflected in this story. Even Kenya's political climate is becoming more unstable as nation gains independence. As I say, the while colonial nations thought that the only remedy of their servitude is independence, but when it did come, it brought chaos because they were never trained to rule themselves, and in between, their memory was kind of erased, and their confidence was completely shaken under the colonial rule. So they did not know how to express themselves. So the corruption and power struggles of the new regime replaced the idealism of the anti colonial movement, and there is no positive change. Bikram finds himself further entangled in a web of dishonesty and corruption, and his position as a go between, arranging steady agreements for the political class, perfectly captures his position as an outsider who is neither entirely a part of new Kenyan leadership nor innocent of its deeds. And I quote, I had been simply put dropped because I was the convenient scapegoat, the disposable outsider, and my usefulness had run out. So, Bikram feels like used by both the British and the Kenyans, and then discarded or disposed of at will because, he was a marginal, and his existence did not matter either to the British or to the Kenyans. Now, this talks about the plight of the Indians who were taken to these places and helped build their economies, forgetting all about the pain and suffering that brought uh, them from their own country to these countries, and they had to suffer in silence because of the exigencies of the British committed excesses on them, and they silently suffered and helped build these nations. But when these nations gained freedom, they did not enjoy the benefits of it, being on the margins. So their situation did not really change. And that is why, Bikram Lal says that he was an easy scapegoat. And so once his role was done as a middleman, he was uh, cast aside or discarded. The novel's investigation of moral ambiguity is connected to this political relocation as well. Instead of being motivated by money, Bikram's involvement in unethical activities is a result of a complicated mix of fear, survival instinct, and loyalty. His moral dislocation highlights the idea that relocation in the novel is about a deeper separation from one's values and sense of self rather than only about geographical dislocation. So, if we look at his life is torn from within because he does not find any harbor in his life, And in East Africa, he was fighting for survival and made all sorts of compromises with his morals, but only to find that he is labeled the real culprit, which he is not, and is subjected to uh, same, and now is living in exile. So this dislocation is not only geographical, but this is also uh, something that affects him psychologically, culturally, and morally. um, as he begins, we can look at these opening lines. He says, "My name is Vikram Lal. I have the distinction of having been numbered one of Africa's most corrupt men, a cheat of monstrous and reptilian cunning. To me has been attributed the emptying of a large part of my troubled country's treasury in recent years. I hate my country's list of shame." So displacement and alienation, they are acute in this novel, as it explores both physical migration, in which we find Vikram Lal's family moving from India to East Africa, and later his exile to Canada, and at the same time the psychological displacement that comes with being part of a diaspora in post-colonial Kenya. And as he says, "I have oscillated between different loyalties. Thus the 8-year-old child Bikram intriguingly finds that he is bestowed with conflicting role models that stand at the two poles. On one end stands his proudly Kenyan, hopelessly colonial." So he is completely confused right since the beginning, and does not really understand what is the role of Indians in this whole affair of the fight between the natives and the Britishers. The double displacement and hyphenated identity create a sense of alienation in the life of Bikram. Um, Changes in identity, affiliation, or self perception brought on by internal conflicts or external pressures can result in psychological displacement, and they do result in psychological displacement in the case of Bikram Lal. Similarly, Bikram feels being cut off from where he had come and suffers a fractured identity. Contradictions between the past and present, as well as between conflicting cultural or social standards, are frequently the source of his fragmentation, as Dongre and Lalwani observe. Bikram Lal frequently faces the trauma of displacement. He investigates it in post colonial situations via the prism of cultural hybridity and the legacy of colonialism. The paradoxes and legacies of the colonial past frequently shape the identities of post colonial cultures, resulting in hybrid identities. So, native customs and colonial influences are blended to create these hybrid identities, which give rise to a feeling of being torn between opposing cultural forces. And so the diasporic subject is always placed in a very precarious kind of situation. And as the narrator says, and I quote, "To the Africans, I would always be the Asian, the Psylocke. I would never escape that suspicion, that stigma." So he feels kind of hopeless at times. Why? Because despite his contributions in building African nations, and his efforts in contributing, he bears this suspicion and stigma of being somebody who has always been taking advantage uh, and not contributing in the real sense. Memory is another very important part of any diasporic narrative, and in this novel also we find how the novel is structured as a remembrance, as Vikram Lal narrates the whole thing. living in exile in Canada. So, memory is both a narrative device and a theme, because Bikram's relocations of childhood in Kenya, marked by innocence, friendship, and early trauma, are filtered through the lens of regret and self examination in later life. The memories are deeply intertwined with the collective memory of or history of Kenya's transition from colonialism to independence, the violence of the Mau Mau uprising, and the shifting fortunes of the Indian diaspora. So, this novel, through recollection of Bikram Lal, reflects on the uh, journey of the Indian diasporic community and also Kenya as a nation. Bikram's act of remembering thus becomes a way for him to make sense of his dislocation and to seek coherence in a life marked by loss and betrayal, moving back and forth, portraying the unsettled nature of memory and the ongoing struggle to reconcile with one's history. So, from the outset of the novel, it becomes clear that the narrative voice not only hovers between the double polarity of innocence and experience, but literally plays with it. And this shift between the two poles is echoed in the very structure of the chapters, which open onto the African plot and go back to the embedding narratives, which concentrates on the narrator's new life in Canada. So there is frequent mixing of present and past, memory and desire. Again, exile is one of the typical features of any diasporic experience, and we know that the writer himself has been living in exile, and like him, Bikram Lal, the protagonist, also flees to Canada as a self imposed exile. And for him, this exile uh, is portrayed as an ongoing state of being, not just a result of migration, but a condition of living in between cultures. And history is marked by loneliness, nostalgia, and longing for acceptance, a search for home that remains unfulfilled. So, Nancy Wixton remarks, and I quote, Lal's childhood memories portray an Eden from which he is inevitably cast out. And certainly he turns out to be an exile, and he is grieving the loss of his Eden at a later stage. Dongre and Lalwani also find his banishment serves as a concrete and symbolic illustration of his position of flux, man unable to fully identify with either his past or his present. And I quote from the novel, I told myself how desperately I loved this country that somehow could not quite accept me. So, here this reveals the ambivalent, ambiguous position of the Indian diasporic community in Africa. Although they embraced Africa, Africa did not really accept them, and that is the reason, people like Bikram Lal had to go in exile. So, Bikram's narrative, which we said follows him from childhood to adulthood, is reminiscent of the Bildungsroma and takes up some of its tropes, such as the move away from the family unit, the acquisition of skills, and the return to the hometown or family circle. So, in the process, we find how he matures and grows as a character. So, rather than suggesting a move from innocence to experience, Basanji seems to imply that sometimes the child's understanding of certain issues is quite intuitive and accurate, while the protagonist, as adult, occasionally fails to understand certain predictable situations. Bikram develops a certain awareness of not being part of a grand narrative, whether it is the narrative of colonization or that of resistance and nationalist struggle against colonization. And this again places him in a liminal space, as he does not really exist. So, Bikram's narrative, which as we find it, we can look at these lines. We don't have heroes. I grumbled to mother once. She glared at me, then looked offended. What do you mean? We don't have heroes. Think of Sri Ram, who was so gentle. He slew the 10-headed Ravan. That's a hero. And Bhim of the Pandavas took on a whole army alone in the great battle of Mahabharata. Not those kinds of heroes, Ma, not gods. What kind, then? What better heroes than gods? Bill as Field Marshal Montgomery riding high on his tank, searching for the lurking enemy behind a sandpile in Tunisia. So, even in his exile period in Canada, Bikram brings the idols of Hindu gods and says his prayers standing in front of them. But I cannot help but say my namaskars or salams to the icons I carry faithfully with me, not quite understanding what they mean to me. So, although they are disconnected from their um, spiritual land, the land of their gods, the gods are always part of their existence. And friends, I can really vouch for them because, as I said, I have seen these people, the diasporic people, clinging to their cultural identity, to their religious practices more ceremoniously compared to people back home. The novel is a narrative which takes stock of the imaginary and the perception the characters have of their own history. And in this respect, Kenya, as it is described by Vassanji, seems to correspond to Rushdie's conception of an imaginary homeland, not as a homeland imagined and fantasized, but as a homeland retold, rewritten with the poetic license inherent in the act of reminiscing. So, Robert Jacharia's comments on Bikram's return to Africa are also very pertinent. Bikram's hybridized identity as an African man of Indian descent is a burden of an imperial history that pulls him back from Canada to return to Kenya in spite of the dangers that await him. And this is how they try to look at their roots. And although he has been labeled as one of the most corrupt men of Kenya, he still goes back to Kenya. So we find that the in between world of Bikram Lal is a nuanced exploration of how personal and political histories intertwine. And through Bikram's journey, Basanji dissects the complexities of belonging in a multicultural post colonial society like Kenya and lays bare the ethical ambiguities faced by those who are living on the margins of power, in this case, the Asians or the Indian immigrants in Kenya. Rather than offering simple answers, and there can't be one, rather than offering simple answers, the novel embraces ambiguity, asking readers to consider the cost of silence, the lure of compromise, and the burden of memory. So, it is not only a story about a man, but a meditation on an era, a nation, and a fractured identity. So, friends, here I stop. These are the references. Um, Thank you very much. In the next class, we are going to talk about one of the most potent contemporary Indian voices and a prolific writer, Amitav Ghosh. Thank you very much. Do join me.